The Archangel Chronicles by Raymond Collotti. Copyright 2023, all rights reserved. Chapter 20, Moses of the Massagetae. The chanting of the warrior host and the clashing of their shields went on and on. Axia looked deeply into my eyes. I grasped her hands and knelt, looking up to her face. "Vasilisa," I said quietly, "I will help you." Axia grasped my hands and bent down to kiss them. She looked over to Abu, who was still standing with his deadly sling hanging from his right hand. She went to him and placed her hands on his shoulders. Then, looking at him all the time, she raised her arms high. The warrior host became silent. "And you, my brave boy, you shall be my cupbearer," she said loudly so all could hear. She kissed him on the head and he blushed. The two ferrets, Atlas and Calliope, climbed out of his pockets where they had been lying hidden and scampered to sit on each of his shoulders, looking up at the queen quizzically. She laughed at the sight. Scarus, shield in hand, came forward. Axia now turned to him. "And you, Roman, all Massagetae will call you from this day forward Scarus the Brave," she proclaimed to all the host. "And though you be Roman, and from the land of cities and fields and fortresses, we welcome you to our land of the blue sky and endless pastures." Scarus bowed. "Aye, me excellent queen, ma'am," he said hoarsely. "I have sworn sacred oaths to protect Adam the Wise. As he has pledged his service to ye, so I do also. My sword is yours." Axia turned to the warriors. "And now we feast," she proclaimed. She clapped her hands, and the priestesses came forward to escort her to her tent. A great feast was prepared there on the plain. Cattle and sheep were slaughtered. Axia's high-backed chair was placed on a dais. Her priestesses stood flanking her on each side. The great feast went on all day. There were great contests of wrestling, boxing, and dangerous stunts of horsemanship performed throughout the feast. The priestesses had cleaned and washed Abu and changed his clothes. He was now dressed in a clean white tunic, belted at the waist, and deerskin boots. Atlas and Calliope had been put into a clean cage with sweet-smelling straw and placed on a table at Axia's side. She delighted in feeding them throughout the feast. At length, at sundown, a great horn was sounded. Axia stood up. The games stopped. The warrior host fell silent. Axia clapped her hands and commanded, "Bring forth the body of our enemy." The crowd parted, revealing 6 warriors carrying a pallet on their shoulders, on which lay the massive body of Thraxsus. They stopped before the queen's dais. "Cupbearer, come forth," she demanded. 2 of the priestesses brought Abu forward to the queen. Axia stepped off the dais and went over to the corpse. She reached down and drew Thraxus's great sword, holding it aloft for all to see. Then, in a swift and mighty arc, she brought the blade down and severed the head from the body. The head rolled off the pallet and fell into the dust. Axia reached down with her free hand and seized the dripping, oozing head by one of its ears and raised it to the crowd, and then flung it to the ground. A great war cry sprang up as a dozen mounted warriors, armed with long clubs, broke through the crowd and, galloping forward, knocked the severed head back and forth between them like a soccer ball, contending to be the next to strike it. Soon their terrible sport took them far away from the camp, their shouts and cries diminishing as they receded into the distance, chasing their ghastly ball. A cloth was handed to Axia. She wiped the blood from Thraxus's blade. She gestured to the crowd. A strongly built man, stripped to the waist, came forward carrying a heavy anvil affixed to a tree stump. He put it down in front of Axia and went down on one bended knee. A great hammer was brought forward and placed into the blacksmith's hand. Axia laid the sword on the anvil and stepped back. She gave the signal. The blacksmith stood to his feet and raised the heavy hammer high, bringing it down with a mighty blow. The sword blade shattered. Axia reached down and picked up the hilt, lifting it high. "Brothers and sisters, listen to what I say. As I have shattered this blade of the enemy, I vow to you to shatter the power of the usurper Artaxis and any who stand with him." Axia turned towards Abu. "Cupbearer, come forth." 2 of the priestesses pushed Abu forward. He stood awkwardly before Axia. "You have slain your first warrior, brave boy, while you yourself are not yet a man. Our poets will sing of your deeds for the ages." A cry went up from the crowd. Abu blushed. Axia handed him the shattered sword hilt. "Take this as a totem of respect. This is your first trophy." Axia raised an arm. "Bring the prisoners," she commanded, and then returned to her seat on the dais. The surviving gladiators were prodded forth, stumbling and limping, hands bound behind their backs. They were now a sorry-looking lot, stripped of their armor and weapons, bruised, bloodied, some barely able to stand. They all bowed their heads, dejected, before the seated queen of the Scythians. "Is there one among you who can speak on behalf of all?" she asked. "Aye, that would be me." One of the group stepped forward. He had a black eye and bruises all over his body. "Tell me then, what should be done with you? Shall we have your heads? Or shall we skewer you on a spear and leave you to rot in the sun slowly?" Axia asked. "We are in your power, Queen. We expect no mercy, and we would have shown none. Such is our fate. But I ask that our deaths be quick as befitting warriors." Axia stood and pointed to the spokesman. "You are no warriors," she declaimed, so that all could hear. "You are far from whence you came. We are honor-bound to shelter strangers, but you have come here to steal our treasures and take us as slaves. We recognize no right to a quick death." I stepped forward. "My Vasilisa, you have asked me to bring light to your people. Can it begin here and now? Will you take my counsel on this?" Axia looked at me regally, with a slight smile on her lips, and nodded her head. "Speak." "I say, send these men on their way. Give them no horses. Give them no food. Leave them to wander these lands with nothing more than one skin of water between them, one knife, one bow, and one arrow. They will have to learn cooperation to survive, and if they do live, they will not be your enemies." Axia nodded. "This is fair counsel, Adam the Wise, but we think that this is too lenient, and it may appear to others to be weakness. Scarus the Brave, what is your counsel?" she said, turning to him. "Aye, these be no men of honor, me queen. They betrayed all of us, and would have done violence to you and your kin. They not be men. They are wild beasts. Treat them as such. Let me lop off their heads. Right now," he drew his sword. Axia turned towards Abu. "Cupbearer, although you are young, what do you say about these prisoners?" Abu blushed deeply. He was nervous, and the more so as all eyes turned towards him. "My queen," he bowed, "I am not wise in these matters, but in my country, the penalty for a thief is to lose a hand." Axia now stood again and extended her hand, palm up, towards the prisoners. "And so this shall be my decree," she commanded. "Kneel down now, prisoners, while I pass sentence upon thee." The guards forced the prisoners to their knees. Speaking in the voice of command, Axia proclaimed, "Let it not be said that she who is worthy of armor, Axia Panoplius, Queen of the Massagetae, is without mercy. You did surrender to us and became our prisoners. Let it also be said that I am not weak, for I will punish you in full measure for your wrongful acts. So now hear my decree. Scarus the Brave, go with 5 of our warriors and take these men now out of the camp. You shall cut off their right hand and tie it around their necks, so they will remember what they have done. You shall bind them together in a line. You shall give them 1 bow, 1 arrow, 1 knife, and 1 sword between them. They shall be sent back from whence they came. It will be up to them as to whether they live or die. They can use these weapons on each other or learn to cooperate and survive. We care not, but let no one give them shelter, food, or aid. So I have decreed." We broke camp the next day. The treasure wagons, now filled with their load of smooth stones, were no longer of any use and were abandoned. The host of Scythian warriors, now numbering several thousand, all mounted, made rapid progress over the plains over the next several days and nights. Each day brought us further along the cyan-colored waters of the Caspian Sea as we headed north. Day after day, we continued along the shore to a point where the shoreline gradually began to curve eastward. We had reached the top of the Caspian Sea, and we were getting closer to the very heartland of the Massagetae. We came to an area of vast marshes and many waterways, braided together and streaming from a large river which the Scythians called the Raha. This was the great river Volga and its delta emptying into the Caspian Sea. We found some high ground near the river's mouth and stayed there for several days. In our progress over the last week, we were joined by more and more bands of warriors, their horses and herds of cattle and sheep. The ranks of the host doubled and then doubled again. The horses, which outnumbered the riders by a factor of 2 or 3 to 1, formed a vast moving body, and together with the sheep and cattle, became a large migration event of people and beasts with a common objective. This stop was a welcome one. The abundance of fresh water and lush emerald grasses bordering the great river gave plenty of refreshment and fodder for people and beasts alike. One morning, I stood on a hilltop with Scarus and Abu looking over the ever-growing camp, a large, mobile city of tents and wagons, yurts and shelters, splayed out upon the great green plain below. "How are we to cross that river?" I asked. "In Mute. Serving with legions in Germany, we built bridges on boats," said Scarus. "But to do that, we needs an army to cut down them trees and saw them into planks and build the boats and bridges. We ain't got none of that here." He held up his hand to shade his eyes to shield them from the morning sun. But he wasn't looking out across the river. He was looking away from it, back to the west where we had come. "Now, me dominus, sir, I ask ye this, were we expectin' company?" I followed his eyes to discern that in the distance was a procession of several hundred mounted warriors moving in a line, flanking several wagons. They were coming towards us. "Trouble?" I asked. "No trouble. They are Roxolani, our Sarmatian allies from the west," said a voice behind us. Coming over the top of the hill where we were standing was Scumaxa, leading his horse by the bridle. "They were sent for. This is the meeting place. They bring our father back to us." "Your father?" I asked quizzically. "Bartatua, but I thought—" "Yes, he has passed into the endless sky," said Scumaxa, "but his body has been kept for us, awaiting our return to bring him to rest among his own people. Now we go to meet our brothers, the Roxolani." Scumaxa mounted his horse and galloped down the gentle grassy slope. We watched him as he grew smaller and smaller in the distance, becoming a tiny figure. We saw him greet another tiny rider in the distance, at the head of that distant column. Later that day, close to dusk, we stood at the end of 2 long rows of the assembled warrior host of the Massagetae. Axia, mounted and arrayed in her golden-scaled armor, high-crested helmet, and flowing red silk caftan, stood waiting, flanked by her 2 brothers. Scarus, Abu, and I stood behind them. Rows of kettle drums beat out a funeral march. A long procession of Roxolani warriors on tall horses paraded in between 2 ranks of Massagetae warriors, all dressed in red tunics and clad in glistening scale armor. These Roxolani warriors were dressed in black scale armor from head to foot, with tall steel black helmets. Their horses, taller and more robust than our steppe steeds, were covered with flexible armored coats, shielding their fronts and flanks, and plate armor protecting their heads. These warriors bore 10-foot lances, some of them draped with dragon banners, flapping in the breeze. The heavy cavalry rode slowly into the camp. At the head of this procession was a most imposing warrior. He came to a stop before Axia and her brothers. He handed his lance to an attendant, undid the chin strap of his helmet, and took it off. A mass of yellow hair spilled out onto his shoulders. In his saddle, he leaned forward, bowing to Axia. Here, I thought, was the very incarnation of Thor, right out of the comic book. "She who is worthy of armor, we greet you as allies and friends. Long have we waited for your return," he said in a booming voice. Axia spurred her horse forward a few steps, reached over and grabbed this warrior's forearm in friendship. "Arsalia, Prince of the Roxolani, my people and I are in your debt," she said. Cheers went up from the assembled host. "You bring many warriors with you, my friend," Axia said, gazing at the procession now parading past her. "Aye, these are dangerous times," Arsalia replied. "Our taxis men search for you far and wide. They know that we ride to meet you, escorting the body of your father, the great and noble Bartatua. We come in force, and we will join with you if we may. You will be welcomed and rewarded, my friends. We shall never forget your service to us, and for keeping our king ready for his return to the resting place, Axia replied. Arsalion bowed again. Together, my queen, we shall drive out that devil Artaxes and his overlords, and the Parthians from the steppes. We shall see that the house of Bartatua is restored, and feast in his halls. He now dismounted, as did Axia and her two brothers. They all embraced, and turned to watch the rest of the processing warriors coming into the camp. Scarus leaned over to me and whispered, "These Sarmatian Dominus looks to be fine heavy cavalry. They are cataphracts, and would be more than a match for them Parthians, I say." He looked at them with admiration. "'Tis a shame that old Crassus didn't have a few of them when he marched his men into Parthia many years ago. He might have come back alive." "Crassus?" I asked. "Who's Crassus?" Scarus chuckled and looked at me sideways. "Surely you've heard of Crassus, Dominus. Sometimes I wonder where you've come from, me friend. Have ye not heard the story of old Marcus Licinius Crassus, the friend and triumvir with Gaius Julius Caesar and Pompey Magnus? Marched out with 7 legions into the desert and was wiped out by an army of these kind of cataphracts and horse archers. Didn't stand a chance. Let himself be led into a trap and was surrounded. Army cut down to a man. He was captured, and molten gold was poured down his throat by those devils." Our attention went back to the procession. At the end came a wagon with a sarcophagus, draped in red and gold silks. The wagons halted before Axia and her brothers. Arsalion stepped forward and took Axia by the hand and led her over to the wagon. She reached up and touched the sarcophagus gently. She turned to Arsalion with tears in her eyes. "My queen," he said, "I deliver to you my sacred charge, the body of your great king and father." Several days later, literally out of the cyan blue-colored waters of the Caspian Sea, the solution to the problem of crossing the great river presented itself. Early in the morning, Scarus and I were having breakfast in our tent, hashing over the events of the past several days. Abu burst through the door, dressed in his silk cupbearer's tunic and out of breath. "Kyrios! Scarus!" he exclaimed. "The Vasilisa bids you come immediately to the beach. Now! Ships have been sighted." We ran with Abu back to the beach to find the queen looking out over the waters gently lapping the shore. A gentle breeze stirred her gowns, and beyond her, far out, the same breeze was propelling a row of triangular-shaped sails, emerging from the mists now being burned off by the early morning sunlight. They were coming swiftly, and I counted 24 of them. We watched as they drew closer, and their brilliant white lanterne-rigged sails caught the rising sun. It was an elegant sight. In all the time we had been traveling along these greenish-blue waters, they had been completely empty. We had not seen so much as a rowboat or a skiff. Abu pulled at my sleeve with excitement and alarm. "Kyrios, who are they?" I looked first to Scarus, who bellowed, slapping me on the back. "Well now, Adam the Wise, what do we have us here?" He threw his head back and laughed. Axia came to me. "Adam the Wise, what new trick have you conjured up for us?" "No trick," I said, smiling. Then I looked to Abu. "And no pirates either, Abu." I looked back to the line of approaching white sails. It would appear to be a small miracle to some, I thought, for here was our friend Theron, our treasure fleet, come to the rescue. The ships glided in on the gentle breeze, struck their sails, and were beached. Crewmen jumped out into the waist-deep waters and dragged the dhows onto the dry sand. They were heavily laden, with the treasure of the Massagetae. There, standing at the bow of the lead ship, was that great big bear of a Greek, Theron himself, smiling broadly, gold teeth glittering in the sunlight. Theron filled us in on his escapades at the camp that night. "By Poseidon's beard, physician, it was touch and go there for a while. I called him more than a few favors to get us here. Good idea you had, by the way. If we hadn't hidden the gold in those caskets of salted fish, it would have been stolen 10 times over by these thieves and pirates." I looked at the crew members, who looked to me like simple fishermen. "What about that crew, my friend?" I asked. "Where did you find them? Surely they were suspicious." "Aye, that'd be true," Theron spat into the fire for emphasis. "But they are fishermen after all. This sea be full of fish. I came up with a story about trading salted fish with the tribes further east. They got excited about the prospects, and the next thing you know, with a few well-placed gold coins and a few eager hands, we have the whole fishing fleet at our service. They're not a bad bunch of lads, after all." Scarus nodded. "Ah, my friend, and just in time. We have a whole host here to move across the great river. These boats here, they be the way." "Aye," said Theron, "but how? Cyrus the Great himself had hundreds of or thousands of ships at hand. We have but 24. Scarus stood up and rubbed his jaw. "I tell you how, me stout friend," he said. "When Caesar crossed the mighty river Rhine in Germany, he made a bridge of boats. There are trees here we can cut. We can make that bridge of boats, anchored across the water, lashed together side by side, with logs and planks between them. The boats will be like floating piers. We'll cut a sod and place it on the planks, and the animals and wagons can cross as if it's on dry land." Scarus went to Axia and knelt before her on one knee. "Me queen, give me 500 men and 3 weeks, and we will cross these great waters with your whole host, every one of them, man, woman, child, and beast." Work on the bridge began immediately, and as predicted by Scarus, took exactly 3 weeks. First, trees were felled under his supervision and fashioned into logs and planks. Scarus, in his command voice, shouting in Greek, organized the 500 men into gangs to cut the wood, haul it to the designated place, fashion it into rough-hewn timbers and thick planks, and bringing the materials down to the site. Other gangs on swift horses scoured the nearby country for hemp and flax. Others fashioned these into thread, and then into cords, and then into rope. The river was scouted to find a suitably shallow spot near sandbars to move the boats. The boats were spaced side by side across the river channel and firmly anchored fore and aft. The masts were removed so the boats became a series of pontoons across which were laid the timbers and then the planks affixed with the ropes so that the whole structure was flexible and strong. Planks were laid to form a deck and then covered with sod from the endless plains. Axia and the Scythians relished the opportunity to have yet another procession, and so it was. 3 weeks later, when the bridge was built, the procession began. First across the bridge of land over the great river was the queen, resplendent in her scarlet silk robes, golden scale armor, and tall helm, riding on a white horse. Close behind her came her cupbearer, Abu, mounted on his pony. Next came her 2 brothers, Scumaxa and Prothesis, in front of the great 4-wheeled cart pulled by 4 large white oxen. On top of the cart was a wooden temple-like structure containing the sarcophagus and the mummified body of Bartatua. Next were 10 large wagons carrying the Massagetae treasure, now unloaded from the boats and transferred from the casks of saltfish and neatly placed in the treasure chests borne by these ox carts. Scarus and I stood and watched the exodus over the bridge of the entire host. They took 2 days to cross. Here was another mass migration of a whole people unfolding before me as I watched. The line of warriors, horses, cattle, sheep, goats, and tented wagons, pulled by multitudes of horses and then throngs of people like a mighty river of humanity, stretching for as far as the eye could see east into the arid lands beyond the bridge. Over the last number of weeks, from far and wide, the horde had grown daily with warriors, shepherds, and families coming from far and wide to swell its ranks to form this mass migration. Axia was a Moses to her people, and like the Israelites, they were crossing dangerous waters on dry land. They now entered their promised land between the two seas. Axia's reckoning with Artaxes would not be far off. Archangel Chronicles, copyright 2023 by Raymond Colati. Music for Chapter 19. Ed Records, Legends. Ed Records, Save the World. Ed Records, Beyond Fears. Epidemic Sound, Mystic Mountain by John Bajork. Epidemic Sound, Our Final Mission by Christopher Mo Ditlevson. Epidemic Sound, A March Across Ancient Land by John Abbott. Epidemic Sound, The Portal by Bonnie Grace. Ed Records, Grand Canyon. Ben Sound, Epic.